Tangier is an important city for the history of American literature. Many American writers in the 20th century lived there, most famously, of course, Paul Bowles and also William S. Burroughs, among others, Truman Capote, Tennessee Williams. Jack Kerouac also spent some time in Tangier, and while his time there was brief, it was a very significant place in terms of the trajectory of his work as a writer, because we could say very definitively that Tangier is a place where Jack Kerouac's adventure came to an end. So if his life is the life of being on the road, he records Tangier as being essentially the end of the road. Now, he did write a book not long afterwards, after his experience there, entitled Big Sur, which is a very dreary work. And he recounts some of that experience here in this text as well, which we're going to be looking at, Desolation Angels. But in effect, he tells us, he bids his Desolation Angels goodbye. In effect, his friends, Kerouac, his friends, Ginsberg, Burroughs, Orlovsky, and others at this particular site. So it's actually kind of sad what happens to him in Tangier and the effect that Tangier has on him. So while his experience of Tangier is not terribly positive, it marks a significant moment in the history of his literary production and therefore in the history of American literary production as well. So we're going to talk about what happened to Jack Kerouac in Tangier. Now, I'm recording this lecture in Bellingham, Washington, in Whatcom County, which is where where Desolation Angels begins. And so it's if you're from Whatcom County, as I am, you live in this part of the world, it's very interesting because this text begins in Whatcom County and it ends in Tangier. So the road that Kerouac is traveling takes him from Whatcom County to Tangier. And so we'll talk a little bit about that aspect of his experience as well in this lecture. Now there's Kerouac. He lived from 1922 through 1969. He's most famous, of course, for On the Road, which was published in 1957. Desolation Angels, the text we're going to be looking at, was published in 1965, just a few years before his death. So he lived a relatively short life. He died of alcoholism. He fairly quickly deteriorated after his experience in Tangier, which was so terrible for him. But we'll talk about that. And I wanted to mention also in passing Dharma Bums, which really recounts his experiences that occur prior to his time on the mountain. And really there is a sense in which Dharma Bums and Desolation Angels are a continuation of the same story, because it's Gary Snyder that takes him or that helps him find his way to Whatcom County. But you can't imagine two more different texts. Whereas Dharma Bums is perhaps his best written work, and not very long and very elegantly written. Desolation Angels is a strange text in his corpus, and it's not characteristic of his other works for reasons that we'll be discussing. Now, let's talk a bit about the composition of Desolation Angels. Here's Kerouac discussing his own approach to the writing of prose. He says, "Nothing could stop me from writing big books of prose and poetry, for nothing, that is, with no hope of ever having them published. I was simply writing them because I was an idealist and I believed in life, quote unquote, and was going about justifying it with my earnest scribblings. Strangely enough, these scribblings were the first of their kind in the world. I was originating, without knowing it, you say, a new way of writing about life. No fiction, no craft, no revising afterthoughts, the heartbreaking discipline of the veritable fire ordeal where you can't go back, but you have made the vow to speak now or forever hold your tongue. And all of it innocent go-ahead confession, the discipline of making the mind the slave of the tongue with no chance to lie or re-elaborate. I wrote those manuscripts as I am writing this one in cheap nickel notebooks by candlelight." And so, indeed, Kerouac's method of composition is quite distinct, and he, as we're going to discuss, compares it to the jazz compositions of African American musicians in New Orleans and San Francisco and elsewhere, in that they consist of what someone like Allen Ginsberg will call jazz blowings, in effect, or improvisational blowings that are akin to the improvisational performances of jazz musicians. And it's also interesting, as he notes here, that they were written without an eye necessarily towards publication. He didn't know if he would publish. It's not really clear that he cared that much, and when he did publish it, he was disillusioned by it all and was not terribly interested in the work that he published and the cultural effect that his published writings had. And so, as Ginsberg used to say, your books will be published in heaven, and you just have to believe in them and go forward. And that's essentially what he did. And so, some people criticized him. Truman Capote said Kerouac is no author; he's a typist. The way that he wrote without revising, but that's simply a false characterization of Kerouac's work, as we'll discuss. Now, here, for those unfamiliar with Kerouac's method of composition, here's an image of his famous scroll that he, when he wrote On the Road, he wanted it to be akin to being traveling on the road, and he wrote it all. He wrote it over a few weeks. Drank a lot of coffee and other stimulants, and produced it without punctuation, worrying about punctuation or stopping. He would write for as long as he had energy, and then he would stop. And in the end, he had this great long novel that came to be known as the scroll version of On the Road. Now, when he published On the Road in its first version, for legal reasons, he had to change all the names of the main characters who were just, in the scroll. Allen Ginsberg appears as Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs appears as William S. Burroughs, and so forth and so on. But his publisher was worried about lawsuits and made him change all the names and greatly edited it. So it was the version that came to be published is quite different from the original scroll. And so if you're used to reading the On the Road prior to, when it was published posthumously, Ginsberg said at one point, someday it'll get published after everybody's dead. And it finally did get published a few years back. I really recommend that you read the scroll version rather than the one that was so heavily edited by his publishers. For those familiar with On the Road, you'll know that Neal Cassidy was an important figure for Kerouac. He was his companion when he traveled on the road, but also was something of a poet in his own right. And Kerouac was inspired by the prose style, the bebop style, as he called it, of Cassidy. Now, Cassidy was not a disciplined writer in the way that Kerouac was, and he didn't produce a whole lot. He did produce some written texts, but as Burroughs observes, one of the most important aspects of Kerouac is people criticize him for his method and say, well, he's just sloppily composing without revising. Not so at all. I think it was Picasso someone asked Picasso once, how long did it take you to paint that masterpiece? And he said something like, 30 years and 5 minutes. And I think really the same is true of Kerouac, that he wrote so much that he perfected his method of composition so that when he finally, produced his works, they came out, so well. But it's because he had, like a jazz musician who plays night after night in the club, he had developed, perfected his technique. So while Cassidy was a source of inspiration for him in his style of composition, it was Kerouac who was really the disciplined writer and ended up producing a very large body of work that has been profoundly influential, not only on the history of American literature, but on the history of American culture as well since the 1950s. Kerouac predicted Cassidy would become a great writer because of the muscular rush of his narrative style, the freedom that allowed him to hold nothing back. This is from the introduction to Desolation Angels. And he said, and here's what Kerouac told Cassidy. He said, "Don't underestimate your pool hall musings, your excruciating details about streets, appointment times, hotel rooms, bar locations, window measurements, smells, heights of tree, and so on," Kerouac wrote to Cassidy. And then 5 days later, after this was, after Cassidy sent this letter to Kerouac from Denver to New York, which so inspired Kerouac. Kerouac sat down. He wrote a full confession of his own life to Cassidy, announcing, he said, "I hereby renounce all fiction." It was a turning point for Kerouac. He had suddenly found a spontaneous new voice for himself that seemed pure music. In order to become the medium for what Kerouac would now call wild prose, written without stopping or second thoughts, he would sacrifice everything: health, sanity, marriage, fatherhood, any vestige of comfort and security. The voice is all would become Kerouac's credo. Now, this is very interesting because prior to this letter that Kerouac received from Neal Cassidy, which so inspired him to develop this style, he was very influenced by Thomas Wolfe. It was one of his main influences, by Ernest Hemingway. He was influenced by Marcel Proust as well. It's important to note that Kerouac's first language, his mother was Quebecois. His first language was, in fact, French, Quebecois French. And so he spoke, French fluently as well. But he gave up. He said, "I don't want to write, literature, quote unquote. I want to write, non-literature." And he no longer wanted to think of himself as a fiction writer. He had a new form of writing, this what he called, spontaneous prose, which we're going to see too is in some ways similar to the surrealists, to what Andre Breton's going to call the false novel, that's written, in this sort of liminal state between consciousness and unconsciousness. But I think this idea about the voice being all, which is going to be inspirational to Ginsberg as well, is also, it has a connection to figures like, Walt Whitman, of course, who had a truly, American voice. And so we can think of Kerouac as writing within this Walt Whitman poetic tradition of emphasizing the voice and the importance of the voice. This is going to become also linked to the idea of the Holy Spirit itself, spiritus. What when Ginsberg will speak of the wind that blows forth from the lungs. For Ginsberg, he's going to say, it all starts with the vowel, with the sound. This is one of the reasons why Ginsberg got interested in meditation, with the om sound of ah, and then consonants, he say, will gather around the vowel. So it's a question of wind, but spirit as in wind, breath that blows forth from the lungs. And so Kerouac's going to, be very obsessed with this idea of the voice and the development of his own voice. And it's reading this letter from Neal Cassidy that really instigates this change in him. Life itself is Holy Ghost, he'll say. And this is from the actual text of Desolation Angels. But there you see Allen Ginsberg reading from his famous reading of Howl in Berkeley. And this idea, think of a howl as a sound escaping from the throat. And this is where, although Ginsberg was, more frankly, a poet, we can think of Kerouac as poetic as well, in the sense that he's going to emphasize this idea of wind, spiritus, Holy Ghost, voice, and which is akin again to a jazz blowing. And Ginsberg is going to find this kind of thinking in Kerouac to be very influential to himself as well. Here, I'll just read you a brief description here from Desolation Angels, where Kerouac describes himself being in a bar listening to jazz. He's with Simon, who was the lover of Allen Ginsberg. He says, it's Peter Orlovsky Simon was the name of the character in this text. "Simon and I miraculously find a bar where two girls are sitting at a table waiting to be picked up. And in the middle of the room is a kid singing and playing jazz on the piano. But the girls don't approve of either Simon or myself. And besides, it's the jazz I want to hear, not their complaints. At least jazz is new, and I go over and stand at the piano. The kid I'd seen before on television in Frisco, tremendously naive and excited with the guitar, yelling and singing. And so this is just a brief passage from this text. And there are also a lot of other wonderful passages, like, for instance, Kerouac's descriptions of burlesque in Seattle in the 50s are really wonderful. But he has other, in On the Road and other texts, he has these descriptions of going into jazz bars, and one can really see how the jazz, this idea of jazz and jazz composition, improvisation, had such a profound influence on him. Now, he was particularly inspired by Charley Parker, who lived a very brief but consequential life and had a huge influence on American music as well. And Kerouac wrote a famous poem. It was an ode to Charley Parker, which you can find him performing fairly easily if you look around on YouTube. So I don't want to go through all of the essentials of what Kerouac calls spontaneous prose in this text that he published in 1958. There are others. I would encourage you to Google this, look this up, and then you can read it more in depth, particularly if you're interested in this method for your own composition of creative pieces. But I do want to talk about the first part of it. And here, Kerouac speaks of the setup. He says you put an object before your mind, either in reality. So you set an object in your mind and you sketch it from memory. And so, for instance, On the Road was written as a recreation from memory after having set forth the object, the experience itself, the reality in his mind, and then sketching it out. Procedure says, and then this is a very important point. It says, time being of the essence in the purity of speech, sketching language is undisturbed flow from the mind of personal secret idea words, blowing as per jazz musician on subject of image. And so the question here is that if we think of the spoken word wind being something that happens in time, time is going to be really important to what Kerouac is describing. That this is something that the prose that he creates, the spontaneous prose, is something that happens in time, and this is why he wanted no interruptions. He would blow for as long as the energy was there, and when the energy was gone, he would stop blowing, and then he would start up again when he had the energy to do so. And then as far as the method goes, no period separating sentence structures, already arbitrarily riddled by false colons, timid, usually needless commas, but the vigorous space dash separating rhetorical breathing as jazz musician drawing breath between outblown phrases, measured pauses, which are the essentials of our speech, divisions of the sounds we hear, time and how to note it down. Now he quotes William Carlos Williams here. And Williams was a very important modernist poet, and Kerouac knew him. Ginsberg introduced Kerouac to William Carlos Williams. William Carlos Williams, of course, cites Kerouac in his text on his book on poems on Peterson, the village where he lived. Williams was an American who emphasized, in this Whitman-esque tradition, emphasized the importance of the American voice, the sound of the American voice, which is why Williams, for instance, was not a big fan of the poetry of T.S. Eliot, who had relocated from St. Louis to England and made himself an Englishman. Williams wanted American poets, writers to write poetry as Americans spoke. And this was important to Kerouac as well as it was to Walt Whitman and Allen Ginsberg. Now, Joyce Johnson, who wrote the introduction to this text and knew Kerouac, personally, and she describes, meeting with him directly after he'd come back from being on the mountain, writes, according to Kerouac's biographer, it was the only novel, Desolation Angels, that he wrote that would be drawn so directly from his journals, passage by passage, rather than being written from the transforming distance of memory. And so this is an important point for us to remember. So if you're reading Kerouac's work, and you want to situate, Kerouac's writing within the trajectory of this particular novel, within the trajectory of his body of published writings, we have to remember then that this novel is different. It's different from his other works because this one was not, the majority of it in any case, was not composed in the same way that On the Road was composed. When he goes up to the top of the mountain at Desolation Peak in Whatcom County, and retreats into nature by himself for a number of weeks. He brings his journals with him, and so much of what we get from this text is drawn from his journals. And so I think it's important to note. So while this is a wonderful text in its own right and very important to read if you want to appreciate Kerouac, you really should also at least have some exposure to a text like On the Road, especially On the Road, which is such a canonical text, to compare and contrast the differences in composition. Now, you might also note there are places in the middle portion of this novel which are more akin to the way in which On the Road was composed. But the beginning especially is very different because it's drawn from these journals. And so some readers, if you're coming to Kerouac for the first time, you might be a little put off by the opening passages, particularly where he's so introspective and contemplating his loneliness on top of this mountain where he's all by himself, because it's very different from these very frenetic texts that he wrote elsewhere. But it's interesting. For those who enjoy reading Kerouac, it's interesting precisely because of its differences as well. Now, I want to mention just in passing that, as was true of On the Road, that all of the characters in this novel, were real people, and that was important to Kerouac because, again, he didn't see himself as writing fiction. But to publish, they had to change the names, and so this is what one might call a roman à clef. You need to know who the various characters are to figure out what he's describing in some cases. Now, you can read it without knowing the real historical personages, but Ginsberg himself in his poetry gave names to the names of the people that possessed them, and so forth and so on. And so same is true here. So now you can also find this on the internet as well. If you go to, for instance, I think there's a wiki page that identifies it, that has an even longer list that identify the names of the key figures in this text. But for instance, Jack Deloz is Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs is Bull Hubbard, and so forth and so on. So bear that in mind, and as we go through some of these passages, I'll put in brackets the actual name of the person being described. Now, again, on the scroll version of On the Road, you get the actual names without the fictionalized version of them. One of the really important figures. Now, he's more of a minor character in this text, Desolation Angels, but Gary Snyder was in Dharma Bums. He's a much more prominent figure. He appears there as Jaffe, and Gary Snyder, who's still alive, was the beat, quote unquote beat, who was most into environmentalism. And he was, long before the environmental movement, he was very much interested in nature and Buddha. He was they were all of the beats were interested in Buddhism, but Snyder actually went to the Far East and he studied Buddhism more formally. It's a prominent theme in his work. And it was Snyder, Kerouac was more of a city boy. And, Snyder got him out there in nature, hiking on trails and climbing up the mountains here in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. Now, Snyder was from Oregon originally. He gets Kerouac a gig working in Whatcom County up in the Cascade Mountains. And it's through the influence of Gary Snyder that Kerouac, goes into nature and decides to take this job as a fire lookout man in the Cascade Mountains. But he does so as a spiritual retreat as well. So while it's a job for him and he's making money, he's all alone, and it causes him to have a profound to more profoundly reflect on the meaning of his own existence in this time where he's all alone and has no access to any stimulants, alcohol, drugs, or so on. He's by himself, and it causes him to become very introspective. Dharma Bums tells about his meeting with Snyder and their first backpacking trips, hiking trips up the mountains together, and some of the other things that took place in the early days before the events that are recorded in Desolation Angels. But this, like I said earlier, I think this is probably Kerouac's most elegantly written narrative, and it's a good introduction to Kerouac, maybe even better introduction to Kerouac than On the Road if you're new to Kerouac. Here's Joyce Johnson. She observes, when he had nothing more to add to the Deleuze legend, Kerouac planned to conform all the names in the various novels he wrote so that they could read like one huge book, comparable to the remembrance of things past, or the more accurate translation of that. That was the Scott Moncrief translation, which was problematic in some ways. It was corrected as "à la recherche de temps perdu," is literally "in search of lost time." But this text, again, remember, as I said, Kerouac's first language was French, and he was enormously influenced by Proust, whose theme was also time. And Jack sort of thought of himself, as Joyce Johnson says, as a running Proust, or a Proust on the road. But as she points out, old age was not in the cards for Jack Kerouac, so he did not have a chance to go back and change all of the names. But if he had, now Proust's novel In Search of Lost Time, it's actually 7 novels, which is one long novel. So this is worth noting, because in addition to this fact of the name change, this would have been one large work, one vast work. And that's what he was thinking of Proust as he wrote these various novels, which were all, we could think of them as chapters of one larger novel. Now, if that's so, this really would be the last novel. Now, there is Big Sur, too. I guess that would be an appendix. I would think of it more as an appendix, because he himself tells us that it comes to an end in Tangier, and we're gonna come back to that. Okay, so here you can see this little cabin that Kerouac lived up on, and on Desolation Peak. If you're living here in Whatcom County, it's just off State Route 20. It's about, you can drive there in about 2.5 hours from Bellingham. You pass through concrete, and then but the hike up to that place is not a particularly easy hike, and I think you pretty much have to get to it nowadays. I think unless the easier way is to get to it through you have to go through Canada and then come down again, because it's very close to the border of Canada as well. But he was dropped off there with some rations, and there was a radio there, and he was up there to watch and see the fires, and he just would spend day after day looking at the clouds come and go, and thinking about this sort of thinking of it in terms of his exposure to Buddhism, which he'd gotten from Snyder and other places as well. On the left is Mount Hozemeen, and this is important to note because this is what he looked at day after day. And in the text, this becomes a figure for nothingness itself, for non-being. And so this is what I want you to kind of think about, this whole question of nothingness, and how when he comes up to the mountain, on the top of the mountain, he's all alone. He comes into, and to put it in metaphysical terms, he comes into an experience with absolute nothingness, or with non-being. And so Hozemeen is a real place, obviously, but in this text, it becomes a figure for the abyss, for nothingness. So every time you come across a reference to Hozemeen, you might want to think about it as being, in reference to the void, or the absolute abyssal. And to put it in Platonic terms, the choral, the chora, the nothing, okay, the nada. Hemingway has, of course, a famous story, our nada who had a nada. This is a similar kind of meditation on the theme of the nada, or the nothingness. Well, here you can see where Bellingham is. This is where I'm recording this lecture. This is where Western Washington University is. There's Mount Baker, which is about an 1.5-hour drive from Bellingham, and Mount Hozemeen is just a little south of there, and it's all in the same vicinity. As you can see, we're very close to Canada. So here's what he tells us once he gets up on those mountains and he's all by himself. He says, those afternoons, those lazy afternoons, when I used to sit or lie down on Desolation Peak, sometimes on the alpine grass, hundreds of miles of snow-covered rock all around, looming Mount Hozemeen on my north, vast snowy Jack to the south. the encharmed picture of the lake below to the west and the snowy hump of Mount Baker beyond. And to the east, the riled and ridged monstrosities humping to the Cascade Ridge. And after that, first time suddenly realizing it's me that's changed and done all this and come and gone and complained and hurt and joyed and yelled, not the void. And so that every time I thought of the void, I'd be looking at Mount Hozemeen until I realized Hozemeen is the void. At least Hozemeen means the void to my eyes, stark, naked rock pinnacles. So if Hozemeen is the void, we got to ask ourselves, well, what does he mean? One of the reasons why, again, I said readers, when they come to this text, particularly if this is the first text that you're reading by Kerouac, so I've had students in the past express frustrations about, particularly these journal entries when he's up there, but when writing about the void is perhaps more difficult than one might imagine. And it also, because writing about the void, the abyss, what is not there, is also, evokes the theme of, which is a metaphysical theme as well, the theme of boredom itself. So there are places where he's very bored and he's writing about his boredom as he stares into the void of nothingness. And so that has a particular effect on us as readers too. So let's just bear that in mind. He says, what a horror when I first saw that void, the first night of my staying on Desolation Peak, waking up from deep fogs of 20 hours to a starlit night suddenly loomed by Hozemeen with his two sharp points right in my window, black, the void. Every time I'd think of the void, I'd see Hozemeen and understand. Over 70 days, I had to stare at it. So he's there, his first day, he realizes, I'm going to be up here alone for 70 days staring at the void. And for a man who is, constantly surrounded by friends, constantly on the road, pursuing one form of stimulus after another, this is a very stark experience for him, and it's one that's going to be transformative in many ways for him. Now, there's an image of what it looks like from inside of this cabin where he lived for 70 days by himself, staring out into the void, talking with no one except every now and then checking in by walkie-talkie, particularly if anybody saw a fire to report. You can see the binoculars there on the desk looking out. This is basically the job that he performed for the Forest Service that Gary Snyder procured for him. He wrote, I thought at first when I got to the top of Desolation Peak and everybody leaves on mules and I'm alone, I will come face to face with God or Thakata and find out once and for all that in the meaning of this existence, find out once and for all what in the meaning of this existence and suffering and going to and fro in vain. But instead I'd come face to face with myself, no liquor, no drugs, no chance of faking it. But face to face with old hateful Deleuze me, and many's the time I thought I'd die, suspire of boredom or jump off the mountain. Oh God, I'm bored. But is Hozemeen bored? Or the void? And I'm sick of words and explanations. Is Hozemeen? Does the void take any part in life and death? Does it have funerals or birth cakes? Why not I be like the void, inexhaustibly fertile, beyond serenity, beyond even gladness, just like old Jack? Well, he's having an experience that is perhaps for the first time in his life. Really, he's coming into to put this in, let's say, as someone, a philosopher like Martin Heidegger might say, he's philosophizing. He's having a metaphysical experience of nothingness, and nothingness itself, to put it in metaphysical terms, is a theme that's also not only linked up with the question of boredom, but the question of death itself, the time and time's end, nothingness, what comes at the end of time, non-existence, perhaps. So here again, you see another angle of what it might have looked like for him as he sat there and walked around this little cabin for 70 nights by himself. All right. I'm going to this passage I'm going to read from now. There's Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, and I want to read a little passage from an aspect of the text that appears a little bit later. This is when after he comes down from the mountain. He's in Mexico City with Ginsberg and Burroughs and some other friends. And Ginsberg is trying to, Kerouac is just kind of laying around in bed, and Ginsberg saying, trying to get him up out of bed and get him to join him. And we're going to see this will be something that happens again in Tangier as well. So Ginsberg, Irwin in this text says to Kerouac, "Get up, you fool." He says and as Kerouac tells us, in one of the rare instances when Ginsberg let slip when he really thought of me. "How can you sleep all day and never see anything? What's the sense of being alive?" So Ginsberg's trying to, prompt him, push him into action. This is a dynamic in the relationship that you can read about in other contexts as well. But Kerouac just lays in bed. He doesn't want to go He doesn't want to go to the University of Mexico. He just wants to lay in bed. And let's listen to what Ginsberg says about Kerouac.
He offered his heart to the United States, and the United States rejected his heart, and he realized what suffering the United States was in for, and saw the tragedy of America as Whitman had seen the tragedy of the United States. When the singer of the nation finds that the nation has sickened, what happens to the singer of the nation? This is Gregory Corso's question. America by his day was sick, militarily sick. Military-industrial complex had taken over. Hard-heartedness had taken over. Everything that, as a Canuck peasant, Kerouac hated had taken over. The mechanization, the impersonality, the homogenization, the money grubbing, the disrespect for person, that had all taken over, and vast wars. The whole, the attack on the provincial in the wars. So I would say America broke his heart.
So that's Ginsberg's take on Kerouac, and it's interesting. There are other, if you look around, you can find other interviews with Ginsberg where he talks about Kerouac. Now Ginsberg lived long after Kerouac, and after Kerouac died of alcoholism, he and others, Burroughs as well, reflected on what happened to Jack Kerouac, and this text really tells us in some sense what happened to him. Why did the road come to an end? Why did it come to an end in Tangier? But this is Ginsberg reflecting on his old friend Kerouac and what he thought happened to Jack Kerouac, which caused him, in Ginsberg's phrasing, to cause him to have a broken heart, in effect. But in this exchange in Mexico City, we get it from Kerouac's perspective, and he's thinking about it in terms of his experience on Desolation Peak, his encounter with the void there, laying in bed and wondering, well, why should he even get out of bed? And he says, he describes this exchange with Ginsberg in these terms. He says, it was Ginsberg and Kerouac's old argument about samsara versus nirvana. Though the highest Buddhist thinking, Mahayana stresses that there is no difference between samsara, this world, and nirvana, the no world. And maybe they're right. Heidegger and his essence and his nothing. And so if that's the case, says I'm going back to sleep. And then here's how Ginsberg responds. He says, but samsara is just the X mystery mark on the surface of nirvana. How can you reject this world, ignore it like you try? Poorly, really, when it is the surface of what you want and you should study it. Well, this is a good question that Ginsberg puts to Kerouac, because there is a kind of a rejection of the world that's going to take place, particularly by the end of this narrative. But we see a hint of it here in his sort of refusal to get out of bed. But they're talking about these metaphysical themes. Nothing. We could think of this what Kerouac is calling nirvana or the no world. We could think of it in metaphysical terms as nothingness, kora, non-being, samsara, this world. If to put it in more, let's say, Platonic, Heideggerian terms, we could think of it as the world of becoming, the realm of the senses. So the question is there a difference between the sensory world and the void? If there's no difference, then I'm going to go back to sleep. Ginsberg, I think, rightly says to Kerouac, look, you can ignore, what you're calling, or what he's calling, nirvana is, samsara is the surface of nirvana. And so you can't ignore what appears in the realm and the sensory realm. And so he's a bit perplexed. He's really trying to goad his friend into getting out of bed and doing more than falling into a kind of a metaphysical depression, which is what seems to be taking place. I'm speculating here, but this is the language of Kerouac. I'm citing his actual language here. Now, here to make this a little bit more concrete, the samsara, here's a definition of it. It's from Sanskrit. It means wandering or world, with the connotation of cyclic, circuitous change. It is also the concept of rebirth and the cycle of all life, matter, existence. It's a fundamental belief of most Indian religions. In short, it is the cycle of death and rebirth. That's a little bit different than putting it in Platonic terms as becoming its link to the karmic cycle of death and rebirth. How much of a Buddhist was Kerouac? At some point, he says he's given up his Buddhism. I mean, you could think of Kerouac. Some people say, well, Kerouac was a Catholic Buddhist and Ginsberg was a Jewish Buddhist. I think Ginsberg, Ginsberg Buddhism was a little bit more deliberate. Certainly, this is the case of Gary Snyder. With Kerouac, you get a sense of him sort of playing around with these Buddhist ideas. How deep does he really grasp them? It's an interesting question. But he's thinking these questions through, drawing these terms from Buddhism. And so nirvana, he's going to, the literal meaning of which is blowing out or quenching, the ultimate goal or spiritual goal in Buddhism, the release from rebirth, is going to be equated here with nothingness, and to put it in Heideggerian terms, non-existence itself. So no longer the necessity to be reborn, to put it in these terms, in terms of reincarnation. He says, back to Hozemeen, he says, it seems as though 6 weeks of lonely, bored solitude on Desolation Peak has come to an end. This is when he's at the end of his 7 days. He says, I think of Jerry Wagner, which would be Gary Snyder, and Ben Fagan, who wrote poems on these lookouts. And I wish I could see them to get that strange feeling that I'm down off the mountain and the whole bloody mess of boredom done. He's tired of boredom. He's tired of thinking about boredom. He's tired of thinking about non-existence. He's tired of thinking about Hozemeen or the void. My desolation adventure finds me finding at the bottom of myself abysmal nothingness worse than that no illusion even. In my mind's in rags. All right. So he's in pretty bad shape. And this is also how Joyce Johnson, confirms this in the introduction when she sees him at this point. And let's bear this in mind, because when he gets to Tangier, when he comes to Tangier, it's in the aftermath of having had this experience here in Whatcom County up on Desolation Peak. Now, if you want to pursue some of these questions in a bit more philosophical way, the text I would recommend, Kerouac himself cites Heidegger, but Heidegger's The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. This is a text that Heidegger wrote right after Being in Time. And whereas Being in Time deals with what Heidegger calls the fundamental modality of being, which he says is care. And here, it's the modality of being, or an easier way to say that is mood, that Heidegger deals with in this text is the mood of boredom. And so this is a text really This is a 400 or 500 page text about boredom, in which you find Heidegger asking the question, can you be bored by boredom? Now that sounds, dreadful, and it is in some ways. It's very hard to think the thought of nothingness, and but in a way, what I would suggest to you is that what Heidegger is doing in this text is not unlike what Kerouac is doing in Desolation Angels. Kerouac was not a trained philosopher like Heidegger, but he's thinking some of these same. He's philosophizing in his own way and according to his own terms. Here's what he reflects when he says, this is again a kind of a depressive moment. He says, I don't know, I don't care, and it doesn't matter will be the final human prayer. For those who believe in a personal God who cares about good and bad are hallucinating themselves beyond the shadow of a doubt. Though God bless them, he blankly blesses blanks anyway. It's just nothing but infinity, infinitely, variously amusing itself with the movie empty space. That's a way of describing core, at least putting it in Cartesian terms, and matter both. It doesn't limit itself to either one. Infinitude wants all. But I did think on the mountain, let us keep mind neutral. Let us be like the void. But as soon as I get bored and come down the mountain, I can't for the life of me be anything but enraged, lost, partial, critical, mixed up, scared, foolish, proud, sneering, shit. And this is one of the interesting things. So for instance, when he comes down from the mountain, he takes the bus from past Cedral Woolley and, Concrete, Cedral Woolley and Skagit Valley. And then he comes into Mount Vernon. He comes into Seattle. He experiences, as I said, the some of the burlesque shows there. And then he goes and he meets with his friends. And so you get this, it changes very dramatically from this experience of the void to suddenly he's immersed in the realm of the sensual, in the realm of experience. And so it's this contrast that is worth keeping in mind. And it's that same kind of contrast that he's calling, in his exchange with Ginsberg, using these terms drawn from Hindu, thought, from Buddhist religion, that are going to, inform the narrative. Let's put it in conceptual terms. He says, and now after the experience on top of the mountain where I was alone for 2 months without being questioned or looked at by any single human being, I began a complete turnabout in my feelings about life. I now wanted a reproduction of that absolute peace in the world of society, but secretly greedy too for some of the pleasures of society. I knew now that my life was a search for peace as an artist, but not only as an artist, as a man of contemplations, rather than too many actions, in the old Tao Chinese sense of do nothing or wu wei, which is a way of life in itself, more beautiful than any. It was to prove that I was able to do nothing, even in the midst of the most roisterous society, that I had come down from the mountain in Washington State. I wanted to be a man of Tao who watches the clouds and lets history rage beneath. So this is really the challenge. Can he maintain the meditative peace of mind that he felt that he was able, at least in some moments, to experience on the mountain, despite his frustration and boredom? Can he maintain that when he's thrust back in the midst of life itself? Now, William S. Burroughs is going to be an important figure in this narrative. That's an image. I took that in Tangier at the Hotel El Munira, and it's painted on the wall of a little bar there, Tangier Inn, which is in the same hotel, which now has these little odes painted on the wall to the Beats who lived there years ago. And so Burroughs is going to, have, in some ways, it's really a misfortune that Kerouac, meets up with Burroughs in Tangier. But let's look at his descriptions of his exchanges with Burroughs, who he calls here Old Guru Gaines, which is William S. Burroughs. Who was a heroin addict? And he says, Old Guru Gaines has the typical bleak, junky dresser. He's describing the dresser in Burroughs' room with a full-length mirror on each creaky door, inside of which hang battered coats from New York with the lengths of the pocket strong enough to boil down in a spoon after 30 years of drug addiction. Burroughs struggled with heroin addiction all of his life. So in many ways, this is what Burroughs says to Kerouac. There's a great resemblance between the dope fiend, so-called, and the artist, so-called. They like to be alone and comfortable, provided they have what they want. They don't go mad running around looking for things to do because they got it all inside. They can sit for hours without moving. They're sensitive, so-called, and don't turn away from the study of good books. Yes, sir, Burroughs says. The dope fiend and the artist have lots in common. Well, this is interesting, when you consider that that Burroughs is comparing his experience of dope addiction with the experience of the artist, and certainly, Kerouac is thinking about this in light of his own period of withdrawal, and perhaps asking himself, is that what I am? Is Burroughs right? Am I like a junkie? I just want to be, alone and retreat inside myself in some sort of interior sense. All right, well, we'll think about that as we think more about Kerouac's experience of Burroughs when he gets to Tangier. And here's his first description. This is Kerouac's first description of Tangier when he's coming from Spain across the Straits of Gibraltar. So here's Kerouac. Kerouac comes to Africa. Kerouac arrives in Morocco. He comes to Tangier for the first time. The American known for traveling on the road and writing about the road, which is such an American theme. But now we find the American coming to Africa, and in a strange way, it kind of destroys him. Now Tangiers grew. You saw sandy barrens of Spain on the left, the hump leading to Gibraltar. Here's where Mr. Hercules held the world up. This is where the so-called pillars of Hercules are. Here the patch-eyed international gem smugglers sneaked up with blue-patched-eyed international gem smugglers steeled up with blue 45s to steal the Tangier harem. The ship anchored in the sweet little harbor, this would be in Tangier, and spun slowly around, giving me all kinds of views of city and headland from my porthole as I packed to leave the ship. I want to be out there in those narrow Medina alleys looking for hashish. He's excited at his first glimpse. The first Arab he sees is too ridiculous to believe. And in fact, it's exactly like Mexico. He feels like, in that description I gave you of Burroughs' junk-filled, squalid apartment was in Mexico City, where Burroughs was too at that time. And so it feels and looks a bit like Mexico to him. He says, the world that's not making history in the present, making history, and this is not a valorized concept for Kerouac, as in manufacturing it, shooting it up in H-bombs and rockets, reaching for the grand conceptual finale of highest achievement, in our times the Faustian west of America, Britain, and Germany. So his themes, his what he's saying here is not terribly unlike the view of Paul Bowles about about Morocco. He's not in this case an advocate of progress, which he sees as in effect a disaster. And so the fact that this world that he enters is not making history is something, at least in his first experience of it, something that recommends it to him. So he's appreciating this fact about it, because as we heard in the quote from Ginsberg earlier, Kerouac was very disturbed about the direction that America was taking at this time in the 50s. Remember, it was Kerouac that coined the term beat itself, which means, beatitude, as in the Beatitudes of Jesus preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, but also it meant also beat, as in so beat by this culture, so messed up by it, so beat by it, that there was you might as well just do what you want and write your own experience, because you can't overcome it. It's too big, it's too grand, it's too difficult to overcome. That's part of what it means to be beat, in the sense that Kerouac, in his coinage of this term. So here are a few images of Tangier I took myself a number of years ago. This is the street scene. This on the right. This is a street very close to the Hotel El Munira, where Burroughs and Kerouac stayed. And so it's just a typical wet street scene. And there you can see the Medina. It's kind of it's an interesting place to visit. Again, it has a European flavor. It's not quite as as you get further into Morocco, the culture changes fairly significantly. But it's a hybrid world. Remember, in Burroughs' Naked Lunch, he calls this the interzone, which is a play on the word international zone, because this was for many years an international zone. It was, which is why it was attracted, people like Burroughs, who could get access to alcohol and drugs and uh, prostitutes and so forth and so on. There were a lot of outlaws that came to Morocco because it was outside of the national laws. It was a lawless place, a law unto itself, in effect. Later, this is going to change when Morocco gains independence. But at this time, it is still a part of this more international zone, and he sees it to be an interesting place. Here, I'll just show you a few images. This is on the shore, towards the shore in Tangier. If you look further out, where you see the cannon there pointing out towards the water, just right on that water would be the coast of Spain. And that wasn't a clear day when I took it, but on a clear day, you can see directly into Spain from the shore of Tangier. Now here's the Hotel El Munira in Tangier. It's still there. It's still as squalid as it was when Burroughs lived there. In fact, it may even be more squalid. It's an interesting place to stay, but it's not a particularly clean place. Here is the Villa El Munira and the Tangerine pub. Now there's a little pub that they've placed in the bottom of it where people can go. It's largely, there are some expats there, but it's largely frequented by Moroccan people. Now this is the place. It was at this hotel where Burroughs wrote Naked Lunch, and he wrote it. It was when Ginsberg and Kerouac got there, it was scraps of it laid all over the floor among rat dung and so on, and so they had to kind of gather up pieces of it and put it together. But this is the place. And so when Kerouac arrives, Burroughs has come into an encounter with surrealism through Byron Geisen, and his prose style has been completely transformed. And so he's a bit frazzled, and he seems a little bit different to Kerouac. But that's the situation when Kerouac arrives at this moment. And he says, here's how Kerouac describes Burroughs. He says, Burroughs doesn't seem any older, except he doesn't seem to comb his hair as carefully anymore, which I realized the next day is only because he's distraught and completely bemused in the midst of his writing, like a mad-haired genius in a room. He carries a huge clicking switchblade, a foot long. Yes, sir, without this switchblade, I'd be dead now, Burroughs says. Bunch of Arabs surrounded me in an alley one night. I just let this old thing click out and said, come on, you bunch of bastards, and they cut out. And Kerouac asks, how do you like the Arabs? Oh, you just push them aside like little pricks. And suddenly he walked right through a bunch of Arabs on the sidewalk, making them split both sides, muttering and swinging his arms like a vigorous, unnatural pumping motion, like an insane, exaggerated Texas oil millionaire pushing his way through the swarms of Hong Kong. Well, Burroughs was a kind of a strange guy, and he would always wear these suits that made him look a bit like somebody who worked for the IRS or something. And you can it's easy to imagine this picture that Kerouac conjures up of him swinging his arms. But it also, I wanted you to read this, or to look at this passage, because it also gives us a sense of the kind of the entitled attitude and the race. There seems to be some racism at work there as well, or at the very least, just a kind of the indifference of Burroughs to the local culture, and the taking advantage of it for exploiting it as a place that is exotic, that he really has no interest in probing very deeply in terms of understanding the culture on its own terms. And I don't think this is true in the case of Paul Bowles, but it is true in the case of Burroughs. Arguably, he did appreciate the Jujuka musicians and so on. But in the case of Kerouac, Kerouac has a very superficial experience of Moroccan culture. This text tells us about the extent of it. So his Kerouac's Tangier is very idiosyncratic, and it's very much on the surface, but it does have a profound effect on him, as we'll see. Kerouac says to Burroughs, he says, "Come on, you can't do that every day." He says, "What?" he barked, almost squeaking. "Just brush them aside, son. Don't take no shit from them little pricks." But by next day, Kerouac says, and this is really sort of the beginning of this sort of depression that Kerouac goes into, is from the moment of his earlier enthusiasm for being in Tangier. And he's waiting, of course, for Allen Ginsberg to show up, and Allen Ginsberg's lover, Peter Orlovsky. And they're going to have this joyful reunion, the three, sort of the holy trinity of the beats, Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Burroughs. They were all planning a meeting in Tangier. But before Ginsberg even arrives, he's already, his observance of the way that Burroughs behaves begins to have an effect on him, and not a very positive effect. He says, "By the next day, I realized everybody was a little prick," and he includes himself, me, Irwin. This would be Ginsberg himself, or Burroughs, the Arabs, the merchants, the president of the USA, and Ali Baba himself. Suddenly, as we climbed the hill of white street steps, I remembered an old sleeping dream where I climbed such steps and came to a holy city of love. This is the dream that he had of this would be a utopian holy city of love, but the reality is Tangier, and it's pretty gritty and gross. He says, "I looked into the black inky maw of a Tangier garage, and the white dream died right there for good, right in the greasy arm of a big Arab mechanic crashing furiously at the fenders and hymns of Fords and the oil rag gloom under one Mexican light bulb. I kept on climbing the holy steps with weariness to the next horrible disappointment." Now, Kerouac is describing the people that he meets as Arabs. He probably is not really even able to distinguish between Arab and Berber people. That's how ignorant he is at this point. But for our purposes, the point here to remember is that he's reality and expectations are two different. Or expectations and hopes are two different things. He expects one thing, and he hopes for one thing, and the reality is very dreary and disappointing. And he begins to enter into a funk that he never really gets out of for the rest of his experience in Tangier. This is an image from the inside of the Hotel El Munira, and there are images on the wall. You can see there these photographs, pictures of the beats. This is there are a few little homages to the time of the beats staying there, but it's, as I said, it's still a very humble dwelling. Here's one of these pictures hanging on the wall. You can see Burroughs and Ginsberg there as well. Now, this is really where what I'm going to show you now. We're going to look at is really the beginning of the end for him, when he very foolishly smokes opium with Burroughs and enters into a depression from which he never really recovers. The experience is a terrible experience. He says, "With an old olive oil can, a hole in it, another hole for the mouth, we stuffed raw red opium in the well hole and got it lit and inhaled huge blue gobs of opium smoke. Meanwhile, an American acquaintance of ours showed up and said he'd found the horse I'd been asking for. The amazing thing about the Arab prostitute," probably, who knows, he was probably talking about a Berber person, who knows, "is to see her remove her veil from over her nose, and then the long biblical robes, suddenly leaving nothing but a peachy wench with a lascivious leer and high heels and nothing else. Yet on the street, they look so mournfully holy, those holy eyes, those dark eyes alone, and all that chastest cloth." So, prostitution remains a fairly significant phenomenon in Tangier, and at this time, this is one of the reasons why figures like Bowles and Burroughs came there. Now, in the case of Burroughs and Bowles, they were both they preferred men. Kerouac did not, so he's soliciting a female prostitute, but this is not a positive experience for him either, particularly after he smokes this opium with Burroughs. Because in a minute, we were stoned cold blue, gone out on holy opium, experiencing, as I say, that turnabout, which said, Jack, this is the end of your world travel. Go home. Make a home in America. Though this be that and that be this, it's not for you. These fellows don't understand you, and Arabs beat their mules. Earlier that day, when I saw an Arab beat his mule, I almost rushed up to grab the stick from his hand and beat him with it, which would have precipitated riots on Radio Cairo or in Jaffa or anywhere else where idiots beat their loving animals or mules, or mortal suffering actors who are doomed to carry other people's burdens. All right, well, he's thinking a bit there, like in terms of reincarnation from his thoughts about, the sanctity of life as well in the Hindu tradition, which also has had an influence on him. But we could think this is almost a kind of a Nietzschean moment as well. It's interesting to compare, Nietzsche in Turin, who famously came out of his hotel and saw a man. This was in Italy, Turin, Italy, saw a man beating his horse, and this was what caused Nietzsche to snap. And so I don't know if this is if this is a deliberate literary comparison that Kerouac is making at this point. But certainly he tells us in his own language, this is the end of your world travels. Go home, make a home in America. This is not for you. He's defeated, in effect, by this experience, and the opium has made it worse. Now this is what Hotel El Munir looks like in the nights, and it is, like I said, it's not a particularly safe place either. I lay there for 24 or maybe 36 hours staring at the ceiling, puking in the hall toilet on that awful old opium mud, whilst meanwhile a next-door apartment featured the creaks of pederast love, which didn't bother me except at dawn the sweet-smelling, sad Latin boy went into my bathroom and laid a huge dung in the bidet, which I saw in the morning horrified. So it just keeps getting worse for him. Always Burroughs had told me that the Chinese say that opium was for sleep, but for me it wasn't sleep, but this horrible turning and horror in bed. People who poison themselves moan, and realizing opium is for horror. And then here's this really interesting observation. He says, I realized my mother was waiting for me to take her home. My mother, who smiled in her womb when she bore me. The best thing to do is be like a baby. This is a strange comment. I mean, now, first of all, Kerouac had a very close relationship with his mother. They were both alcoholics, and they liked to drink together, particularly in his later years. And he writes about her very affectionately and with great, tenderness and love. But he's thinking about, he wants to go home. He wants to go back to his mother and to be like a baby, as he says. And in a weird way, this is exactly what he does for the last few years of his life. He just goes home, stays with his mother. They sit around, drinking and watching television until literally he destroys his health. Here's a picture of Jack with his mother holding a cat with whom he had this very close relationship that you find sometimes Ginsberg writes about it as well. And Kerouac constantly comes back to this theme of the importance of his mother to him, who he venerated very much. It says, now on the opium overdose, I felt snarling, dreary thoughts about all Africa, all Europe, the world. All I wanted now was Wheaties by a pine breeze kitchen window in America. That is, I guess, a vision of my childhood in America. Many Americans suddenly sick in foreign lands must get the same childlike yin. Like Thomas Wolfe suddenly remembering the lonely milkman's bottle of clink at dawn in North Carolina as he lies tormented in an Oxford room. Or Hemingway suddenly seeing the autumn leaves of Ann Arbor in a Berlin brothel. Scott Fitzgerald, tears coming into his eyes in Spain to think of his father's old shoes in the farmhouse door. So it's quite interesting that of course, these were all literary figure precedents for him, whom he looked to quite particularly in his pre-Neal Cassidy days. Thomas Wolfe was a really important influence on him, Hemingway and Fitzgerald as well. And he's comparing, his dream of a box, of some Wheaties by a Pine Breeze kitchen with these moments in their writing as well. So this is a very interesting kind of it's a kind of a genealogy that he's creating here, writerly genealogy that he's situating himself within in this experience that he has, in which he says, now it's time for me to go home, to return to my Wheaties. And then he says, by the time that Ginsberg and Orlovsky finally arrived in Tangier, for their big triumphant reunion with us in Africa, it was already too late for him. Ever since then, he says, I've lost my yin for further outside searching. And then he himself tells us, he says, it was a little sad. Burroughs would be too tired to go out, so Ginsberg and Orlovsky would call up to me from the garden, just like little kids calling at your kitchen window, Jackie, which would bring tears to my eyes almost and force me to go down and join them. Why are you so withdrawn all of a sudden? Cried Orlovsky. And I couldn't explain it without telling them they bored me as well as everything else. A strange thing to have to say to people you've spent years with. All the lacrimum tears of things of sweet association across the hopeless world, dark. So don't say anything. So what he's really saying, and we're going to see this at one of the last lines of the narrative, is farewell to my Desolation Angels. And it's clear from other passages in the text that the angels that he thinks about on Desolation Peak are his friends and so he's bored with his friends. Now, for the beats, there was one point at which it was Ginsberg compared the association, the friendship between the beats with the close, loving, let's say brotherly, loving friendship of the Beatles when Ginsberg went to a Beatles concert and was just so happy to see that how the Beatles, when they played together, obviously this was in the early days of the Beatles, they liked one another. In Ginsberg's description, they loved one another and they were close friends. And the power of the Beatles, and from the way that Ginsberg saw it, was in their close, loving, friendly, brotherly association. And so this brotherly bond of the Beats that has been so important for American literature and for the literature of each one of these figures. I mean, for instance, it was Kerouac who inspired Burroughs to start writing. It's not clear that Burroughs would have ever written without Kerouac's goading him or inspiring him. But it's all at an end for him now. He says, even my good friends, they bore me. I'm just done. I just want to go home. Here's this little bar, the Tangier Inn that I mentioned, that's on the first floor of this hotel where they're staying, where they drank and where you can still go today and have a beer, and you can go inside it and you'll see they've painted on the wall these three figures, Kerouac, Burroughs, and Ginsberg. So it's the end of the road for Jack. Tangier is literally the end of the road. And he says, at that very moment, the manuscript of On the Road was being linotyped for imminent publication, and I was already sick of the whole subject. Nothing can be more dreary than coolness. All this was about to sprout out all over America, even down to high school level, and be attributed in part to my doing. This is the beginning of the 60s. God, how right Hemingway was when he said there was no remedy for life. When you're young, you work because you think you need the money. When you're old, you already know you don't need anything but death, so why work? So it's very ironic that at this very moment, On the Road is, after years of never being published, On the Road is finally going to be published. It's going to make him a very famous man. And in fact, as Burroughs and others will say, a man who very much changed the fabric of American society in terms of creating a kind of a cultural revolution. But he himself wanted no part of it. He was done, and it was in Tangier that he had reached the end of the road for him. So he says to us, so what do we all do in this life which comes on so much like an empty voidness, but warns us that we will die in pain, decay, and old age horrors? Hemingway called it a dirty trick, and he agrees, in effect. Remember, Hemingway committed suicide, and Kerouac is going to say, "Well, I'm a Catholic, so I can't commit suicide, but I can sure drink myself to death." And that's really what he did, which is a form of suicide. And so this is a strange parallel with Hemingway as well, in terms of how they both come to an end, and in both cases prematurely. I later had adventures in Big Sur that were really horrible, and this is he documents this in his novel, The Big Sur. But it's something that if you like Kerouac, you definitely should read it. But it certainly does not have the heart that a text like On the Road has. And he tells us himself that these were horrible adventures, and says only as horrible as you get when you get older, and your last moment impels you to test all, to go mad, just to see what the void will do. Suffice it to say that when Neal Cassidy said goodbye to all of us that day, he looked for the first time in our lives. For the first time, he failed to look me in the eyes, but looked away shifty-like for the first time in our lives. I couldn't understand it, and it seems very wrong. A peaceful sorrow at home is the best I'll ever be able to offer the world in the end. So I told my Desolation Angels goodbye, a new life for me. So he describes this scene in more detail in Big Sur, but it's this moment where he unpacks the box of books on the road, and Neal Cassidy looks at it, and it's clear that this whole, if you've read On the Road, the last few lines of it are, "I think of Neal Cassidy, I think of Neal Cassidy, I think of Neal Cassidy." It's an ode to friendship, but if the friendship with Ginsberg and Burroughs and others is over in Tangier, then also this is an important moment that he alludes to in the text, because his friendship with Neal Cassidy is also over, and both Neal Cassidy and Jack Kerouac seem to recognize, or at least this is how Kerouac interprets it. And so when he says goodbye to his Desolation Angels, he's saying goodbye, in effect, to his friends, and he says he's going to go into a new life, and he does, and that life includes no more writing, for instance. And, he spends the last few years of his life not only drinking with his mother, watching television, baseball a lot too, but he invents a little baseball card game that he plays. And he just it's almost like he reverts to this kind of adolescence of some sort. It's actually what happens to Jack Kerouac in the end, when you consider what an important figure he is, and how gifted he was, and what a great impact he had on American literature and American culture. His end is certainly very sad. Now, not long after this moment with Neal Cassidy that Kerouac is describing here, Neal Cassidy was in fact arrested for possession of marijuana. He was placed in prison, and he later died. There's some very interesting stories of him and his association with Kim Kesey and the driver of the Merry Pranksters bus on what Tom Wolfe will call the candy Kool-Aid acid test. This is not the Thomas Wolfe, but Tom Wolfe, who documents the early experimentations with acid and early hippie culture that Kerouac has no part of, but that Neal Cassidy becomes involved in as well. But he later freezes to death on a railroad track somewhere, and also dies quite young. Ginsberg has some moving poems in memory of Cassidy as well that are worth looking at. So Jack Kerouac, as you can see there on his tombstone, he died at a fairly young age, but not without having made a pretty significant impact on American culture and American literature. So he's an interesting figure. As much as I really enjoy this book, and I think that it teaches us so much about Kerouac and about American culture as well, and about the American experience in Tangier, I do think that you can't just read this to get a full sense of who Jack Kerouac is. You have to also read some of his other texts. I would particularly recommend On the Road and Dharma Bums.